Uh, Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the team, Calcutta Comparatists 1919, I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 79th lecture of the 1619 lecture series today. Calcutta Comparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences, and it carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literature envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee, and which is introduced in 1919 at the premises of University of Calcutta. And for your kind information, Calcutta Comparatives 1919 currently doing online lectures, publishing blogs, and doing national biography series from our website, and we are organizing online lectures on various topics which is like interdisciplinary in nature, and it is delivered by academician and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Anyway, I won't take much time, and now I request our chief coordinator Archita Ramuli to formally introduce our speaker of the day. Over to you, Archita.
Thank you, Pratim. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. A very warm welcome to all of you and a very good afternoon to Professor Elam. I'll introduce our speaker of the day today. Professor Elam is an assistant professor in the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Hong Kong. In 2018-2019, he was a fellow in the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University. He was also a Mellon Sir Seminar postdoctoral fellow in Bibliomigrants, a very interesting topic, at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from 2015 to 16. He has received degrees from both the universities of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Northwestern University. Professor Elam mainly writes about activism, anti-colonial revolutionaries of the 1920s, anti-racist thinkers of 1930s to 40s, Third World Solidarity in the 1950s, 60s, anti-apartheid movements of 70s, AIDS activism in the 80s, 90s, some very crucial essential topics. Among his publications are World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth, Anti-Colonial Aesthetics, Post-Colonial Politics were published last year from Fordham University Press, and there is Impossible and Necessary Anti-Colonialism, Reading and Critique, was published by Orient Platform in 2020 as well. And today's lecture will be based on this very particular text. Professor Elam has also edited two volumes on revolutionary anti-colonial writing, Reading Revolutionaries in 2014 and Writing Revolution in 2017. He is currently working on an anthology of political theory from the Global South, a series of essays in Hong Kong, and a biography is his great uncle. We have put his webpage on our website and social media handles, and we'll also put in here in the YouTube chat box as well, so that you can get an idea of his brilliant works. If all of you have got a glimpse of the introduction to his work that we shared before this lecture, then you will know that this lecture will be based on how anti-colonial thinkers theorized inconsequential practices of egalitarianism in the service of an impossibility, a world without colonialism. Impossible and Necessary is this book is a South Asian edition of World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth. It has a foreword by Prathama Banerjee. This book recovers a genealogy of anti-colonial thought that advocates collective inexpertise, unknowing, and unrecognizability. Early 20th century anti-colonial thinkers endeavored to imagine a world emancipated from colonial rule, but it was a world they knew they would likely not live to see. Written in exile, in abjection, or in the face of death, anti-colonial thought could not afford to base its politics on the hope of eventual success, mastery, or national sovereignty. Impossible and Necessary recovers an alternative strain on anti-colonialism. To learn more about this text, let us welcome Professor Daniel Elam. Thank you, Professor Elam, for joining us today on our 79th lecture of the 1619 lecture series. Over to you, Professor, and please begin this. I think it's going to be an amazing session today.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the 1919 Calcutta Comparativists. It's an amazing lineup, and it's an honor to be number 79 in this. I got to look at the lineup, and it's a fantastic program. So thank you very much for having me. You gave away the first 3 paragraphs of the talk, so I'll skip it. No, thank you very much. but I'm happy to kind of answer questions about that, as well as, especially in the South Asian edition of the book, it's an honor to have Pratama Banerjee write a really concise forward, which is about, which kind of opens up different questions that the book sort of opens up, but she brings out in full. And so we can talk about that as well. I think it's related. So today's talk is taken largely from the conclusion of my book. So in South Asia, it's impossible. It's called Impossible and Necessary. And what it tries to do, what the book tries to do, is to align anti-colonial thought in the 1920s and 30s with philological and comparative philology in the 1920s and 30s. So one coming out of South Asia, and the other being produced largely by German Jews writing in what would be exile from Nazi Germany. And my argument is that what they share is not a sense of a desire to be an authority, a desire to be an author, but rather a desire to be a reader, a desire to be a critic. And therefore, these kind of projects of reading, of anti-colonialism, of critique about conditions of unmasterability, inexpertise, and imperfection, which is to say, what I'm trying to do here, I hope, is to render anti-colonialism truly synonymous with anti-authoritarianism. And I love the titles of both editions of the book. On one hand, Impossible and Necessary gives the kind of the secret away, as it were, of the projects. Comparative philology being both an impossible and necessary project, anti-colonialism being both an impossible and necessary project. The North American edition of the book, World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth, is a more kind of explicit juxtaposition of Eric Auerbach's demand for the literature in the face of fascism and Frantz Fanon's demand to imagine a world beyond colonialism, one that he or us will likely never see. And although it's settled, philology is a curious choice, and so, but I suppose I'm among friends in speaking to comparative literature students. But comparative philology in the 1920s, I think, quite excitingly, was experimenting with a methodology, with its scope, and its political commitments. So philology, which became the art of reading slowly, or literally the love of words, becomes, in the hands of Jewish German philologists in exile, a way of writing about a literature or a literary world that might survive fascism, even though they most likely wouldn't. So they imagined these reading practices which were conducive for an egalitarian world, rid of its murderous drive for purity, defined instead by hospitality, heterogeneity, and improvisational assemblage. So put together, thinking early comparative literature and anti-colonialism together shows us, I hope, that the practice of an anti-authoritarian close reading, and then therefore the disavowal of authorial mastery, reshapes and reconfigures kind of current debates about critique and practical and discussions around radical politics. So in contrast to previous studies of anti-colonial writing that have suggested and focused on revolutionary outcomes, and therefore they prize national independence and sovereignty and authority, what I'm arguing is that anti-colonial writing offers us a political aesthetics centered on a commitment to inconsequence as a way of refusing future mastery and expertise. So drawing on this unacknowledged strain of anti-colonial philosophy, what I'm hoping to do here is to illuminate an alternative theory of literary and political critique that then comparative literature and post-colonial studies become the benefactor of. And then, as the South Asian edition title then says, what I suggest is that we foreground comparative literature and anti-colonial thought as impossible subjects. So a perpetually unmasterable discipline in the first instance, and philosophers committed to a perpetual disavowal and relinquishment of mastery in the second. So the forms of anti-colonial and philological thought presented in the book, and some that we will talk about here, argue for reading and communal criticism, not in order to cultivate mastery or some kind of scholarly expertise, but precisely to disavow mastery altogether. So these thinkers urged readers to read for its own sake, that is, for total inconsequence. Reading in this formula was a practice of egalitarian anti-authoritarianism, precisely because it urged readers to refuse calls of authorship and related the authority. So to remain a reader, and to remain a reader, especially with others, was precisely the goal of this theory of reading. To become or to remain a reader and thus divest oneself of authorial claims was to fundamentally challenge the logic of British Empire and European fascism, which claimed to prize self-mastery as the alleged proof necessary for national independence. Right. That's a very, 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 very broad overview of the book. And now I'll kind of focus a little bit more on something that I'm thinking through and what becomes the conclusion of the book. Now, comrades, Fanon begins his conclusion to the wretched of the earth. Let us leave this Europe which never stops talking about man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners, at every corner of the world. Come, comrades, the European game is finally over. We must look for something else. So what is to be done when we come to an end, when the game is finally over? Our final act of anti-colonial refusal might just be to quit, to stop, and to leave. So it's an act that is an end that cannot possibly be the end. Frantz Fanon died before Algerian independence, the absolute bare minimum for the world that he demanded, and his makeshift homeland gained independence in 1962, but his birthplace, Martinique, is still under French rule. The other figure of the talk today will be Mbedkar. Mbedkar lived to see national independence from the British Raj, but had correctly all along predicted that colonial regimes would hardly atrophy from the shift from Viceroy Mountbatten to Prime Minister Nehru. So in response, Mbedkar drafted one of the most radically democratic constitutions for the newly independent Indian Republic, and then watched in horror as the Congress Party jettisoned slowly but surely its egalitarian assurances. Mbedkar died, quote, reading on to death in 1956, still seeking Begumpura, Bhakti Sant Ravidas's imagined egalitarian utopia. We shouldn't fool ourselves. The colonial world will outlive us too. How do we retain a commitment to social, egalitarian, and emancipatory politics without deluding ourselves that these projects will be realized within our lives, or even perhaps the lives of our friends? Despair and nihilism are certainly insufficient for an anti-colonial politics, but I think they guard against the equally unsatisfactory politics of optimism and hope. So rather than taking up some sort of anti-social orientation, the kind of anti-colonial thinkers and philological thinkers that we can discuss turn instead to a radical politics of the present. So politics can only be the art of the possible for those whose lives are secured by the state, or in other words, only for those who can confidently know that they will live to see the possible attained. Those whose lives are not guaranteed by the state, or those whose lives the state actively expects to end, cannot afford the luxury of these politics. The wretched of the earth require instead an impossible political theory in the service of a contingent and unknowable and necessary present. So in short, what does anti-colonialism look like from a Bethesda hospital in 1961, in the case of Fanon, or bedridden and nearly blind in Delhi in 1956, in the case of Mbedkar? So allow me to suggest, following that first line of the last section of Wretched of the Earth from Fanon, allow me to suggest that in the final instance, anti-colonial, anti-authoritarianism demands that we stop and then that we leave. And for the book of this talk, I'm drawing on the main focus is on B.R. Mbedkar and Frantz Fanon, who offer conclusions that refuse to be ends. Mbedkar and Fanon thought together reveal a particular strain of utopian, I think, anti-colonialism and anti-authoritarianism, though a lot of caveats around the term utopian there. That this kind of utopia was not and could not be exhausted by a telos of its alleged realization, either as individual autonomy or national sovereignty. Conscripted to participate in a world that they had not chosen, Ambedkar and Fanon nevertheless endeavored to imagine that world otherwise. Their vision of a post-colonial future, both alluring and also grievous, stands at the center of most anti-colonial thought. But it was a future that many anti-colonial thinkers, especially Ambedkar and Fanon, knew that they would never live to see. Anti-colonial thought was written in exile, on deathbeds, in abjection, or in the face of declined experience. Anti-imperial thinkers sought to create a vocabulary that could simultaneously capture the grandiose utopianism as well as the self-effacing acquiescence necessary to imagine a world that they would not live to see. They attempted to create a language sufficient to imagine political collectivities motivated solely by the fact of their current impossibility. They invented aesthetic forms necessary to imagine a worldwide egalitarianism noted in the implausibility of any future at all. I think there's a number of different ways that we can align Ambedkar and Fanon, and I'm happy to talk about how some of those work and some of those don't, perhaps in Q&A. But I think I'll skip the kind of quick rundown of that and jump instead to the way I would like to align Fanon and Ambedkar, which is on the basis of their shared commitment to rendering anti-colonialism truly synonymous with anti-authoritarianism, as well as the shared acknowledgement that such political ideals were unlikely to be attained within their lives. So we must therefore recognize in their anti-colonial practices and anti-colonial writings a particular anti-nihilist non-futurity. They neither languished in the easy rejection of a post-colonial future, but at the same time, they were not convinced that any predictable future was necessarily securable. So it's possible to call this body of thought, I think in its most humble form, a politics of the meantime, or a politics for those stuck in the waiting room of history. What anti-colonial politics could take care of people whose anonymous deaths would certainly precede utopia. But I think in grander terms, this is a radical politics of the present, or what Kama McLean has called a politics of impatience. So unable to sit and wait for a formal revolution to occur, these thinkers imagined ways of enacting it in the present, even if it was in minor, unintelligible, and often illegible ways. So Fanon's conclusion to the wretched of the earth should draw our attention to a particular strain of stopping and leaving that refuses by abstaining, resisting, and walking away. So Fanon's call to leave this Europe is addressed to a heteronomous collectivity of comrades who are encouraged to stop trying to emulate Europe, quote, for they will do a better job at that than the rest of us. Instead, Fanon's comrades must, quote, look for something else. Such a disruption makes it possible to, quote, and this is the final kind of famous line from him, endeavor to create a new man. But despite its seemingly and quite movingly grandiose appeal, Fanon's call is mitigated by two curious rhetorical moments. First is his admission that there is nowhere to go. How does one leave every corner of the world? Second is his insistence that to stop and leave will always be only in the service of a mere attempt to endeavor to create, which is in French slightly different. A phrase he uses twice, but is also used in French, is not synonymous at all with to create, as most analyses have assumed. There's a kind of significant difference between to endeavor to create and to create here, and I think that it matters for Fanon. Stopping and leaving in Fanon's formulation is yet another experiment at the impossible. It is to leave without having anywhere to go. It is to stop a dominant continuity without guarantees, except for one, that by leaving we will become, at least fleetingly, an us, comrades. We might be surprised by the addressee of Fanon's demand to leave. After all, shouldn't it be Europe who stops and leaves? By 1961, especially, Europe had indeed begun to leave. India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Vietnam, and Indonesia had already achieved national independence from the English, French, and Dutch empires. And a year after Fanon's death, France would abruptly and disastrously abandon its North African holdings. So if you ask Europe to leave, it might eventually do so. But as Fanon had diagnosed across his writings, there were plenty of people keen to take Europe's exact place. Moreover, the wretched of the earth must stop and leave because, as Fanon had written in Al-Muhajidid in October 1958, colonialists and colonial apologists will perpetually insist that empire stop leaving. So to stop leaving is to insist on continuing and staying, to to colonize is to insist on continuity. Continuity, consequentiality, and progression towards maturity thus mark the logics of colonial rule. And also, I mean, the kind of famous line from J.S. Mill, right? The maturity marks the ability to become an independent nation state. Colonial rule promises a future where we will become closer and closer to realizing ourselves, or at least the colonized subject will come closer and closer to realizing themselves as mature and self-knowing, productive ruling subjects. So to stop leaving this world is to reproduce it, to participate in engendering a future already determined and mastered in advance. To stop and leave, on the other hand, is to refuse and therefore rupture this continuity. So what happens if we stop maturing, refuse the promises of liberal self-mastery that we might then attain? Fanon's more common phrase to describe the behavior of colonizers is that they, quote, never stop. Europeans, quote, never stopped placing white culture in opposition to other non-cultures. They never stopped complaining that the native was slow. And in the conclusion, right, they never stopped talking of man and yet massacre him at every one of its street corners. National independence is no guarantee of colonialism stopping. And Fanon, I think, is especially pessimistic on this point. Colonialism never stops, even if it has changed faces, because the new leaders have, quote, slurped every lesson from their European predecessors. Even if violence is necessary for national independence, which is a claim that Fanon makes quite ambivalently, it is also itself impossible, though perhaps in a different sense than the one I usually use. Violence will certainly rid the colony of its colonizers, but if it, quote, never stops, then its end will most certainly be what Fanon calls collective suicide. This is a quote from Fanon. The apotheosis of independence becomes the curse of independence, because the end of colonial rule is not the end of colonialism. So declarations of national sovereignty, burdened with narrow-minded nationalism, and, quote, magnificently worded phrases straight out of Europe's treatises on ethics and political philosophy are the proof that colonialism has continued uninterrupted, or that it has never stopped. Colonialism continues after colonial rule, because as Fanon repeatedly argues across his work, but especially, I think, in Wretched of the Earth, the post-independent subjects insist on his individual sovereignty over and above his relinquishing power to the collectivity, the unknown collectivity of the unknown masses. The individual, with his, quote, barely veiled wish to be assimilated into the colonizer's world, rejects a spontaneity of sorts in favor of predictability, knowability, and colonial recognition, and then recognition by Europe. The masses, instead, anonymous, heteronymous, spontaneous, required the individual step aside in favor of community and of unknown comradeship. The masses do not seek recognition, they seek increased affinities and act in ways that cannot entirely be predicted or known in advance, and whose future inheritance we necessarily remain bewildered and perplexed. Fanon's anti-colonialism is a strategy of immediacy foregrounded on the exemplary discontinuity of the revolutionary moment, and the contingent, the singular, or the violent impropriety of one's own thought. This type of politics requires imagining and foregrounding in the face of imminent or even certain death, a politics not accountable to regimes of recognition, but rather to the time being, the passing moment, and the final instance. We must stop, and we must leave our own selves in order to favor the collectivity of our unknown and for infinitely unknown comrades. These unknown masses are the comrades Fanon invites into being. So who is this we that Fanon addresses as his comrades? Jean-Paul Sartre, in his introduction, makes a fairly well-intentioned mistake of assuming it is solely Black men talking to each other, from which Sartre, from his kind of awkward position, kind of over here. But I think we cannot be so sure. I think this we is also something, and this is something that Kenneth Sture has recently written about. This we is an invitation to prompt to tune in to an unsettled collectivity. It's a we that we cannot know. It cannot be decided upon. It cannot be decreed, because it is also a we that will exist at some point without us. This us, this we that is formed by refusing to continue and refusing to stay, is ephemeral, fleeting, and shifting. It is risky, unproductive, and unrecognizable. It is political and aesthetic. Annika Javare had called this this kind of us, quote, fiction of our togetherness and an impossible limitlessness that we need. Ambedkar interrogated thoroughly the politics of stopping and leaving. Some of these experiments were to the chagrin of Dalit communities who sought his advice and support. In an address to Dalit sex workers in Bombay in June 1936, Ambedkar says, quote, "There are only two ways open to you. Either you remain where you are and continue to be despised and shunned, or you give up your disgusting professions and come with us. I insist that you must give up this degrading life." He, unsurprisingly, is booed and chased out of the room by the women, who are shocked at his sudden resort to moralizing and respectability politics. And without denying the paternalism of Ambedkar's demand, I suggest that we nevertheless note a fundamental distinction between something like Gandhi's project and Ambedkar's project, where Gandhi might have said stop, a reasonable assumption that is based on other lectures that he made to sex workers. Ambedkar offers, quote, this additional, quote, "and come with us." So stop, Ambedkar demands, and leave with us, an us that has now expanded its reach and endeavored to create a new collectivity. Ambedkar theorized, I think, multiple times across his career, and theorized stopping and leaving multiple times in order to refuse both colonial on one hand and Brahminical authority on the other. So allow me to, what I'll do is I'll briefly describe two of them so that we can have time to linger on Ambedkar's final act of anti-colonial refusal, a refusal that he asserts in the final instance at his conclusion. So one, at a protest in Mahad, Maharashtra in 1927, Ambedkar burns a copy of the Manusmriti and calls on 3,000 Dalit protesters to stop scavenging, eating carrion, and begging. In his address to women the following day, he demands that they either stop having children or stop raising them as untouchable. An editorial written against the protests uses Ambedkar's words to suggest that, quote, "untouchables only have themselves to blame for their untouchability." But Ambedkar responds, "For too long, untouchables have enabled caste Hindus," or what he was at that point calling touchables, "by remaining in their villages. Not simply is it necessary to stop," Ambedkar writes, "Dalits must, quote, walk a new path. It is difficult to walk a new path without having it shown to oneself. And so I hope that Dalits will take the lead in emancipating our own people." Phrased differently, if you will allow me, Dalits must stop, leave with us, and endeavor to emancipate one another. Example 2. Following the 1940 Lahore Resolution, in which the All India Muslim League demands the creation of Pakistan as a separate nation state, Ambedkar offers what seems like a fairly spiritless support. Quote, "If Muslims want to be a different nation, it is not because they have been, but because they want to be," he concludes. Ambedkar, throughout his career, was deeply ambivalent about national sovereignty, weighing the benefits of recognition, liberty, against the egalitarianism of an ever-shifting consciousness, fraternity. So a cohesively kind of shared sentiment among Muslims, otherwise absent and often a threat in Indian politics, would produce an us that would stop negotiating with the Hindu majority and leave. But Ambedkar adds a significant warning. The Muslim League's demand for national sovereignty, as opposed to community, on the other hand, would replicate the authoritarian logic of the British Raj and the Hindu majority state. So there will be, because there are no kind of minoritarian organic filaments, and this is a kind of thing that Ambedkar is taking from his training as a sociologist, because there are no minoritarian organic filaments that would otherwise produce occasional social cohesion, Pakistan will discover that it has neither stopped nor left. Pakistan will have inextricably tethered itself to the continuity of imperial dominance. Pakistan's Muslims will leave without stopping. Ambedkar's protest at Mahad and his analysis of Pakistan represent two significant points in a career of theorizing minoritarian community representation, authority, and sovereignty, all the way up to his work in the Indian Commission and work on the Indian Constitution. Moreover, I think these two moments portend Ambedkar's renunciation of politics altogether, and by the time kind of around 1951. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Ambedkar consistently argued that liberty and equality were necessary but insufficient conditions for a society that would guarantee egalitarianism. Only fraternity could be the essential requirement for social and therefore political proper egalitarianism. The creation of Pakistan would ensure liberty and even perhaps equality, but its fraternity would have been forged by the shared desire for recognition, not a shared desire for egalitarianism. In Ambedkar's estimation, this might be fine for Muslims, but for Dalits, and in the final instance, Ambedkar chose fraternity. In the final instance, 2 months before his death, Ambedkar stopped and left. On 14 October 1956, alongside 500,000 Dalits, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism. The spectacle of his religious conversion has garnered much scholarly attention, which has tended to view Ambedkar's longstanding concern with Buddhism as proof that conversion was either a political stunt or a simple process of changing his mind. Ambedkar's choice of Buddhism, quite to the contrary, was measured, cautious, and studious, allowing him to, in Anupama Rao's phrasing, underscore the impossible yet necessary task of annihilating caste. In the 1920s, Ambedkar had threatened to leave Hinduism and had entertained the possibility of converting to Islam, Sikhism, and Christianity, but he found none of these particularly appealing. Following his catastrophic loss to Gandhi in Pune in 1932, Ambedkar began to give lectures on leaving the Hindu fold. In a speech to the Bombay Presidency Mahar Conference in Bombay in 1936, Ambedkar offered Buddhism as the only way possible to eradicate caste. Shortly before his death, he published what we'll look at in a second, The Buddha and His Dhamma, and had just finished another unpublished manuscript, Buddha or Karl Marx, when he died in December 1956. For 20 years, Ambedkar experimented hesitantly and unknowingly with religious conversion. Even though Buddha and Karl Marx, Ambedkar's posthumously published essay, technically answers Ambedkar's 2 decades long question, which practice, Buddhism or Marxism, offers the greatest possibility of egalitarianism? The answer, which is Buddhism for Ambedkar, hardly appears straightforward or at all assertive. Because of that, I think it's important to turn our attention then to the mass conversion of October 1956. It was a fairly decisive moment in both Ambedkar's life and in Dalit history. Anupama Rao has identified Ambedkarite religious and political experimentation as constituting and perpetually reconstituting a new collectivity. Ambedkar's decision to convert might be framed as follows: to stop being a Hindu, which is to say, stop being an untouchable, to leave the fold, and to endeavor to create a new religious, social, and political collectivity. In this sense, Buddhism was a purposeful and provocative choice. As Gail Umveld has traced, Buddhism was an improbable, anachronistic, and an irrelevant choice. Dalits, as Hindu untouchables, were in theory allowed reservations or guaranteed positions at universities and governments and jobs. But so by converting to Buddhism, Ambedkar not only stopped being untouchable, but I think more radically, especially for someone who had spent part of his life drafting the Constitution, Ambedkar stopped seeking the security of the nation state. He left the privileges that it might have offered on the condition, but only on the condition of obedience to its terms. Moreover, Buddhism's relationship with Hinduism asserts a minoritarian politics of entangled equivalence, rather than difference, which is why Ambedkar, although he was attracted to Sikhism because of its historically anti-caste politics, found it nevertheless an unsatisfactory option. Ambedkar's critics wondered what would be gained by conversion. He responded, and I think this is the quote that's up. Oh, I think it's one back. The untouchables, is there one slide further up? Do I have them out of order? I'll read it aloud from my notes. This is a long quote from Ambedkar in response to his critics. Quote, "The untouchables, it is true, will not gain wealth by conversion. Politically, the untouchables will lose the political rights that are given to the untouchables. This is, however, no real loss. Socially, the untouchables will gain absolutely and immensely, because by conversion, the untouchables will be members of a community whose religion has universalized and equalized all values of life. Such a blessing is unthinkable for them while they are in the Hindu fold." As Ajay Scaria has written, Ambedkarite Buddhism articulated an egalitarianism built on the grounds of Dalit universalism. Christoph Jaffrelot writes that Ambedkar's conversion was, quote, "not an escape, nor was it purely an individual step. collective conversion was the expression of a social revolt. Conversion is social gain in two senses, I think. First, in the sense of a value immediately granted. Second, in the sense that the social itself gains and expands the conditions of its own inclusion. In Buddha and His Dharma, another book that was posthumously published as a guide to Dalit or Navayana Buddhism, Ambedkar argues for a collectively fraternal Buddhism, that stops castes and walks away, but without leaving others to suffer. Ambedkar's particular form of Buddhist renunciation does not abandon others. Its perpetual and fungible fraternity renders a collective a site of asylum for others who have also stopped and left. In Leela Gandhi's formulation, Ambedkar's Buddhism is, quote, an initiation into leaving in order to abandon abandonment and to exit exclusion. As Javari has written, Navayana Buddhism declares that running away, abandoning, is necessary for the annihilation of caste and the collective reconfiguration of the idea of equality and democracy. So in other words, there's a kind of curious paradox at the core of Navayana Buddhism that makes it possible to stop and leave, but to endeavor to do so with others. So to refuse to leave a suffering stranger while simultaneously leaving this world in which that stranger might involuntarily remain is thus the core of Dalit Buddhism. So in Buddha and His Dhamma, Ambedkar's formulation is somewhat more extensive, and we might track this by way of his reinvigoration of Pali vocabulary. And here are the virtues. I think, this is the screen this is from. First, Shila, which is to avoid and do evil. Second, a combination of Dakama and Dana, which avoid renunciation of the world, but that those are tempered by Upeka, which requires remaining in the world, an act that is a refusal to be detached from suffering. Third, Virya, which is right endeavor. It is, quote, it is doing with all your might whatever you have undertaken to do, which is, in other words, to create anew. Coupled with Kanti and Upeka, which is doubled again in his list, this requires forbearance and remaining unmoved by the result and yet engaged in pursuit of it. Fourth, Karuna and Maitri, the determination to extend loving kindness and fellow feeling and universal fraternity to all living beings. So Ambedkar's new path of Dalit Buddhism might be, if you will allow me, tentatively phrased this way. We must stop, comrades, and leave, but we must do so with others. But to leave our process of stopping if others are not able to stop and leave with us, and in the meantime, to endeavor to create a world in which those others might, having attempted to leave, stop and find refuge. In so doing, one offers herself to a particular sociality of strangers who might not yet be known or touched. Ephemeral collective effervescence, marked by the elective, though constrained affinities of mass conversion, is made possible by the fleeting politics of having stopped and left the Hindu fold with thousands of anonymous others. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism is while relinquishing simultaneously the sovereignty of insuperable difference, nevertheless an act of leaving the Hindu fold. Ambedkar's conversion thus foregrounds its own necessity and its own impossibility. This is a radical interruption, I would say, to the procreative continuity of caste oppression. Ambedkarite Buddhism is an assertion that the world should be otherwise, but it is not yet and might not be within our lifetimes. And it is on the basis of this tragic condition, not in spite of it, that we must endeavor to create a heteronomous egalitarian collectivity, and that us will be ephemeral, incomplete, and imperfect. It will be a hodgepodge melange, but it might reconstruct the world. But just like Fanon could not leave this world, Ambedkar and his Dalit followers could not leave India. They were in an impossible position, being a minority with nowhere to go. Fanon and his comrades could not leave this world. The form of anti-colonial refusal that we've been discussing does not leave so straightforwardly as running and fleeing, such are the conditions of kind of fugitive thought, as Juliet Hooker has written, even though those might be the conditions under which anti-colonial thought is written. Stopping and leaving is a declined experience that reveals the egalitarianism of renounced expertise, unfulfilled mastery, and the disavowing of the self-knowing subject. It is the tentative assertion, and this is a phrase I've borrowed from Roland Budd, that the something that one is should be openly expressed as provisional, revocable, insignificant, inessential, and in a word, irrelevant. So I've given you the model for anti-colonial stopping, leaving, and endeavoring, and to create the Fillonian lineup that I want to draw out. And now I'm going to turn briefly to Eric Auerbach, who gives us a different model for a comparative literary model for stopping, leaving, and endeavoring to create. So if you've read Mimesis, you will remember that, the works of Eric Auerbach, you will remember that points of departure are also starting points. I can give you the German if you're interested. So a philology conducive to Weltliteratur, world literature, offers a critique in which, and this is his essay, this is largely from his essay in 1952. So between Mimesis and his essay in 1952 on the philology of world literature, he offers us a critique in which mastery is, quote, virtually impossible, and which produces a work of art in which unity is finally ungraspable. It is a critical project whose only imperative is to depart in order to begin again, to enter into the sudden fiction of us with its heteronymous unknown others in a world. That's the project of anti-colonial critique, and that's also the project, I think, of philological critique in the face of fascism and in the face of colonialism. It's what Elam has called, and this is the quote from the Elam, morale minoritaire. It's a set of guidelines, and I find this particular passage to be extremely beautiful. A set of guidelines of politics and us that is at once impossible and also inevitable, and which breaks up even as it forms, a life of rupture and discontinuity within a majoritarian world formed by the continuous, a morality and a politics as an aesthetic. That is to say, common self-creation and reorganization, always reformulating, for which it would be vain to want to eventually make whole, closed, or complete. Without any guarantees, then, such minor inconsequential practices, like this Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism, and seen in this light, and a certain type of philological practice, find points of departure for a world that might be otherwise, and in the meantime, take them as starting points for an ephemeral egalitarianism, say for that one moment in October 1956 among 500,000 Dalits. Mimesis by Eric Auerbach is required a conclusion, and I'm happy to also talk about Mimesis as a work and as a bizarre founding text for comparative literature. We can save those questions. But Mimesis required a conclusion for a project that needed to end before an analysis of its inexhaustible subject could be finished, because, as Eric Auerbach noted himself, it would be wholly impossible to give due recognition to everything instructive and interesting. Most scholars think that Auerbach enters the book in his own conclusion, where he becomes perhaps its protagonist. Ambedkar willingly, now I'm mixing up, Auerbach willingly admits in a later essay that Mimesis was quite consciously a book that a particular person in a particular situation wrote at the beginning of the 1940s. But to say that Auerbach shows up as a diegetic character in the conclusion is not quite accurate. The character Auerbach has been our Dante, or perhaps our Beatrice, for the journey through Western literature, offering plenty of asides and personal commentary along the way. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Allegedly written without access to libraries and the critical editions while Auerbach was in exile in Istanbul, Auerbach worries that his book is non-scholarly, though he is also keen to note that the book owes its very existence to the lack of scholarly resources available to him. Edward Said, in various iterations across his career, stretches the drama of Auerbach's claims to its limits, reading, as Amir Mufti has suggested, Auerbach as the text rather than Mimesis. It has now been exhaustively demonstrated in really, really quite amazing books that neither Istanbul lacked libraries nor Auerbach colleagues. Istanbul, as Kedar Konak has written, was not uncomplicatedly outside Western Europe in the 1940s. In many ways, it was quite central. But we might place Auerbach's kind of rhetorical excess less in the context of his forced exit from Marburg in 1935, and more in the context of his famous desire to exit the world entirely in 1952. And yes, here's the quote from this. I will not embarrass myself by trying to read the Latin, but I'll briefly kind of give you a quick translation. The good man is someone for whom everything is for whom the entire world is familiar. The better man is he who can find home in any world in the world, and the perfect man is he who has for whom everywhere in the world is entirely alien. That was a completely bad translation. I urge you to go do the proper translation. Auerbach continues. Hugo of Saint Victor intended these lines for one whose aim is to free oneself from a love of the world, but it is a good way also for one who wishes to earn a proper love of the world. So Said would repeatedly actually quote in Baker's quoting of Hugo of Saint Victor, but he rarely bothered with the sentence that followed. This longer selection, which you see before you, veers towards a much more curious sort of renunciation, and not one that can be straightforwardly aligned with asceticism or exile. In his self-conscious reinterpretation of Hugo, Auerbach offers us a different sort of politics for the critic. The renunciate who frees himself from a love of the world is a renunciate committed to purity and self-mastery. The critic, on the other hand, is someone who exits the world while knowing there is nowhere else to go. She commits instead to the insufficient, the paparatas, and the unknown, terra alien terra. Her philological home is the earth, this famous line from Auerbach, not because she is an ethically righteous cosmopolitan, but because she is committed to an earth that is necessarily impossible to know in its completeness. This is why we insist that mimesis, I think, is a text that is necessarily fragmentary, partial, incomplete, imperfect, and inexpert. For the sake of time, and for the sake of not forcing you to hear the droning of my bizarrely accented voice, I'll skip to the kind of the thrust of the end of this. If you've read mimesis, what you know about mimesis is that there's no kind of methodological statement. There's no context. What Auerbach provides you with is a paragraph or two of a text, and then he gives you this magnificent reading of that one paragraph. And the idea is to show the representation of reality in all of Western literature. And then at the end, he shifts, after doing another beautiful reading of To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, he shifts to this moment, to a kind of claim that we must recuperate the fleeting heterogeneous paragraph, precisely not because it's unique, but because everything must be celebrated for its impurity, its heterogeneity, rather than its homogeneity and its purity. And this is in direct contrast to fascism, which he has just experienced. In other words, the fleeting. So what he gives this term, the practice of this, which he later describes in a different essay, is something that roughly translates to reality concepting, or reality conceptualization. The fleeting of experience of grasping a concept of a reality that is, quote, diametrically opposed to locating, let alone supplying, any definitive answers. Instead, it invites endless interpretation and speculation. So Auerbach captures, in lieu of a total account, only the fleeting moment. This is how mimesis is so partial. A fleeting moment in which multiple consciousnesses perhaps share an incomplete reality must be stressed, quote, not in the service of planned continuity, but for its own sake. The moment, the random occurrence, seized from a homogenizing continuity, is therefore that moment when we, as critics, emerge. It is here that we give our individually subjective selves over to the shared anonymity of others' reading practices, of others' critiques. These moments are minor, unimpressive, and random, and totally, at the end of the day, insignificant. These are all phrases that Auerbach uses. For Auerbach, these are moments that the author has no access to. It's only to the reader who will have read enough. For there is always, this is a line from Auerbach, for there is always going on within us a process of formulation and interpretation whose subject matter is always our own self. So in other words, to read, to critique, is to relinquish one's own mastery to the multitudinous collective of we, the critics, who cannot be known in advance, the discontinuity appearing formulation that is incapable of being absorbed into the authoritarian logics of homogeneity, continuity, and consequence. So if you allow me to phrase this slightly differently, Auerbach's philological critique is first to end a project in the face of its ineluctable incompletion and partiality, second, to abandon a world of homogenization in order to embrace a world of perpetual unknowability, and finally, to surrender ourselves in order to capture and emphasize that fleeting moment where we become a collective subject of random moments. Or, if you will allow me to put it even more simply, to stop, to leave, and to endeavor to create a new world and a new human to inhabit it. Nothing remains in the final instance to find him, the reader, Auerbach writes in his afterword to Mimesis. At first glance, Auerbach's reader seems to stand in opposition to the reader that the thinkers that he has been drawn to has attempted to theorize. But perhaps Auerbach has found himself. Perhaps Auerbach finds himself in the characters, and we can talk about this more. But Auerbach presses on. Quote, I hope that my study will reach its readers, both my friends of former years, if they are alive, as well as everyone else for whom it is destined. The readers, a collective of friends who the book is destined to find, are unknown and unknowable. What type of criticism is done for friends who might be dead? Auerbach is being quite literal here. He has written and read for friends who are unable to flee Nazi Germany and who have therefore likely died, though he cannot know, from Istanbul. So Auerbach, in other words, offers his work of art to the anonymous dead in the face of what appears to be a lifelong exile. The resigned, unsatisfied, inexpert critic has ended an essentially incomplete task. He is left without anywhere to go. He longs for friends who have not survived, but also for friends who he will never know, who we can call comrades or we. His readers are inconsequential as well, and they are anonymous, and reading with them will make a fleeting world possible. Anti-colonial and philological thought offers us a model of critique in the service of a world that we will not have lived to see. It is an impossible task for an impossible politics, and it is impossibly urgent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very insightful and enlightening lecture. If you want to, if you allow us, we can go to the Q&A session because there are many questions there in YouTube chat box. We can take some questions from there.
I'd be happy to.
Actually, we have lots of questions here.
Sorry, I just.
Yeah, and also we have. Is he here or the Professor Pramanik is here?
I think Minmada is like somehow facing network issues or something. If he joins us, we'll add him in the stream.
Yeah, sure. Professor will show the questions on the screen.
Yeah, I found them. These are all fantastic questions. A bit daunting. So thank you very much. Thank you so much for taking the time of your day to listen to someone ramble about incoherence and inconsequence. And thank you as well for this kind of beautiful lineup of questions. Shall I just read the question as I try to answer it? Is that the best possible way of doing this?
I'll show it on the screen. You can read. I can read it for you as you want. Here's the first question. What is Should I read?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. What is your take on the idea of the world making and the idea of anti-colonial thought? Do you think anti-colonial thoughts can eradicate the existing notion of world making?
I think this. I mean, what I take your question. I mean, thank you. So, what I think I'm getting from this question is the difference between perhaps anti-colonial thought and something like a Heideggerian world-making project. In which case, I think that those are diametrically opposed projects, right? Anti-colonial thought is about a kind of tentative, at least in my analysis, is about a tentative experimental process at creating an egalitarian world, whereas someone like Heidegger, the process of world making was to make the world in order to master it. And I think anti-colonial thought doesn't have the certain strain of anti-colonial thought that I'm interested in. Certainly envisions a utopian post-colonial world, but it's not one that is mastered in advance of existence. I think that would be clearly the key difference. And at the same time, there's a kind of historical question here too, which is to say that like Adam was written about this, which is to say that there was a kind of programmatic, pragmatic project of world making after empire that had to occur. And that takes place slightly separately. So I think one of the things that I'm interested in about the 1920s and 1930s is, and especially in the British Raj, it's a moment where it seems both somewhat likely that the British are going to leave, but also totally not likely that the British are going to leave. And so you have this kind of open moment where you can theorize all forms of political community without having to reduce them to the nation state. I think that figures like Ambedkar, certainly Ambedkar, Gandhi, Lala Hardayal, Bhagat Singh, were all trying to think about this, all of these various utopian politics that were not reducible to the nation state, or not even reducible to knowing what the world would look like after colonialism, but acting on behalf of it nevertheless. So I think it's both a kind of philosophical question, I think, if you're asking from the kind of Heideggerian point, and also a question of kind of historical moment. This is a moment where it was sort of impossible to imagine a world after colonialism, but all the more necessary to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And like, it's amazing that you are proposing a new kind of reading from this very anti-colonial perspective. It's amazing. Like, it's so new, and this is amazing, just amazing. I don't know more what to say. And moving on to the next question. It's from Rimpa Mondol. Rimpa is asking, according to Samuel Huntington's thesis, there's a possible clash of civilizations. Where did you say your idea of anti-colonial thought will place Ambedkar Dalit Buddhism in respect to Samuel Huntington's thesis?
I have so many issues with Samuel Huntington's thesis that I wouldn't know where to begin. I wouldn't want to take Navajana Buddhism and have to put it in conversation with Samuel Huntington. And I think part of the I guess thinking of it sort of outside of the line of Huntington, is that Huntington's vision of this clash of civilizations would be about two visions for world dominance, McWorld, Jihad, something like and that's later, but these kind of varying and competing visions for a total world. In Baker's Navajana Buddhism, Dalit Buddhism is a way of imagining political community in a world that it cannot leave. And so, it operates in a kind of different logic. It operates in a logic of non-domination, but at the same time, self-care, egalitarianism, fraternity, which is certainly not about world domination in the Clash of Civilizations thesis, but rather a way of thinking egalitarianism, perhaps in spite of, in the face of domination. I don't know if that's really answered your question. I haven't thought about that juxtaposition before. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. There's another part of this question. Let's show that as well. Civilization, as Huntington says, included Hindu-Islamic civilization, and India would be the hotspot of clash. Then where and how would the Ambedkar's idea be intervening?
That's a really fantastic question. I would have to think a lot more about that. I think I don't want to give a kind of flippant off the cuff answer to that, because I think that given the way that Ambedkar re-theorized Hinduism, re-theorized caste, and then attempted in the service of the annihilation of caste, was very much about relying on this. I mean, how should I say this? The sources that Samuel Huntington finds and brings to use to declare India a Hindu-Islamic civilization are the same Orientalist texts that were used to justify colonialism and later then to justify caste. And it's actually Ambedkar then takes those exact same texts, these kind of very Orientalist texts, and uses them to rethink the very notion that Hindu-Islamic civilization is even a thing, and therefore that caste, by virtue of kind of reading backwards these texts of Hinduism and of Islam, Ambedkar is actually able to rethink what an India or what a kind of Hindustan without caste would look like. A kind of, I don't want to say secular. I think that's not quite the right word, but he pushes this kind of this debate around the religiosity of South Asia beyond the question of civilization and into a question of actually about philology. But that's a long-winded tangential answer to a question that I'm afraid I'm ill-equipped to answer. But thank you.
Thank you so much. And Professor, this is a very personal question. I just want to ask that, you're talking about that how Ambedkar wants us to realize the human subject that would be fundamentally incapable of caste. So, in this context of this COVID-19 situation and the pandemic and whatever India is going through, and we can see even in the cremations and burials of dead bodies of the COVID-19, of people who have suffered from COVID-19, the issues of caste and religion and communities coming up. So, do you think Ambedkar proposition will be possible in this scenario, or in the post-pandemic world?
You're the first person to ask this question. It is a question that I've been worried that someone will eventually ask, and it's so thank you for being the first person to ask it. So the chapter on Ambedkar in the book is a chapter about contagion, right? And it's about Ambedkar's use of kind of 19th century biological models of contagion to theorize how one is never kind of oneself is never bounded by one's kind of seemingly obviously bounds, right? We touch, we spit, we move around. And so, in other words, this model of contagion, which is we spread disease to each other, right? This model of contagion shows us that there's no such that caste is actually touchability or untouchability is actually entirely impossible, right? And so he's trying to use this notion of contagion to eradicate caste at its very core, right? We don't know where our bodies end, so how do we then decide who can be touched and who cannot, for example, right? I wrote this chapter well before COVID, and so the chapter is celebrating this notion of contagion. We need more contagion. We need more contagion. And as the book came out, it came out in the middle of COVID, and so there's this kind of horrible realization that I have a chapter that is suggesting in some ways a model of contagion as an egalitarian practice. On the other hand, I think, right, is precisely as you just said, right, it's that COVID is lethal, and COVID does not know caste, and so in the first instance, right, one's contaminability, one's ability to be contagious, one's ability to contaminate with COVID, right, exceeds caste caste structures, right? And so in that sense, one might be able to take this moment and say, look, one can annihilate caste by virtue of realizing that the human body is infinitely extendable in all sorts of unpredictable ways. So that's one option. At the same time, the social reality of this is such that and you can see this both in the U.S. with the distribution of vaccines to Black communities, in India, the treatment of some people over others, right? That caste and racism, casteism and racism and class find a way of reasserting themselves nevertheless. even at the moment where COVID, where kind of a contagious disease shows that we extend well beyond ourselves in ways that we cannot predict. I hope that kind of makes sense of the question, but it's a question that's been on my mind precisely because a chapter written in celebration of Contagion coming out in December 2020 is a bizarre thing. So thank you.
Yeah, we'll have to go through the book and the chapter, and then maybe we can get back to you again.
Thank you.
And the next question, Pratham, can you show once, because I think there's some problem with my network. Okay, this is from Shalmoli Chaudhuri. A very exciting framework of stopping and living from oppressive structures. Other than hinting at subject formation against sovereignty, what is the political potential of this subject?
Thank you. Yes, I am. I mean, I think what I think these thinkers are, what I think someone like Ambedkar or certainly someone like even Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, are thinking about a certain type of human subject that is perpetually non-sovereign, which and acts on behalf of its non-sovereignty. In other words, it's a kind of a drive or a wish for a world where sovereignty isn't the marker of sovereignty or recognition, both of the self or of the nation, right? Are not the markers of deserving to live, deserving to experience something like freedom. And so to rethink, so I think Hannah Arendt and then Foucault have these two different versions of the kind of same sentiment, and I will butcher quoting from them both, but this notion that one should not try to figure out how to be governed differently, but how to not be governed at all, that's Foucault. And Arendt's is something like, to not be governed at all is to experiment with a non-sovereign impossibility. And so in that sense, thinking those together, right, you kind of have a political philosophy that thinks about subjectivity beyond the demand for sovereignty. As to the political potential of the subject, I think it's precisely that I want to stay away from this notion of potential that I think then demands us to think about a certain type of futurity. What will this non-sovereign subject look like in the future? What are the values to be accrued by this non-sovereign subject in the future? I think those questions then begin to push us in ways that bring us back actually to questions of sovereignty and recognition. So instead, what I want to think about is, what if we think about non-sovereignty of the self of political community without any sense of what it will become, but rather that in this moment, right now, in the meantime, it takes care of us and it takes care of our friends. And it forms a kind of egalitarian, fleeting, ephemeral moment that we can then, that's the utopia that we can enact very quickly in very, very minor ways. If that answers the question.
The second part of the question is, can I connect your reading to Rancière's part about, or is the subject universal in a different way, perhaps even challenging the frame of comparativism?
I can't quite speak to the Rancière part, but I enjoy. I'm really enjoying the provocation of your second question. So thank you. I think there's a couple of ways of thinking about this, and if I can stop me if I keep going in a couple of directions and all these sprawls. But so one is something like the limits of comparison, right? At what point is it impossible to compare? There's no universal standard to it. Thus, we must stop comparing, right? This isn't quite the argument of Natalie Melis's grounds for comparison, but she's gesturing towards the limitations of a certain type of universality that comparative literature has always relied on. So on one hand, that I think is one answer. On the other, I mean, this is someone like René Etienne, Marcel Detienne, who are thinking about the notion of comparison and comparativism as actually the fundamental practices of egalitarian politics, which is to say, if I can compare me to you, then there's a certain kind of assertion of equality that's established in that moment. It might go away. I mean, and we've seen in the history of comparative literature that European literature is compared to South Asian literature, and then it finds its way to some sort of bizarre hierarchy in which, what was it, a single shelf of a good European library is worth more than all of South Asia and Arabia. That's T.B. Macaulay's famous line. So comparativism isn't necessarily always gesturing towards equality, but that first initial claim that that this object can be compared to that object is a certain, to me, is a certain type of way of saying these objects have an equality. That's the basis of the beginning of comparison. Whether or not that goes towards continuing that equality, I think, is a different question. But that's the initial kind of thrust of comparativism, at least as I would like to see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. And there's another question. Thank you for the lecture, Professor. Is it viable to think that such an approach to anti-colonialism can in effect counter the soft power and covertness of colonialism that lurk around?
I mean, I think this is precisely what I would like to imagine. I mean, so my fundamental premise is that we live in a world that is still colonial. The colonialism has not ended. There had, of course, been national sovereignties granted, but by no means has colonialism ended. And it seems unlikely that the logics of colonialism will end in our lifetimes. And so, and whether or not colonialism takes the form of occupation, which it is doing which is doing now as well, or in the form of soft power or convertness, soft power and neocolonialism in terms of economic exploitation. And there's kind of two ways that are talked about colonialism's living on. A certain type, yes, I do think that a certain type of kind of fleeting, ephemeral reevaluation of anti-colonialism as a way of kind of taking care of oneself and taking care of one's political community in the meantime is absolutely necessary to thinking about, because we can't have anti-colonial projects be judged on their success. We won't live to see it, but we might imagine anti-colonial projects judged on the basis of our ability to care for friends right now, and in the world that is in the service of a world that is anti-colonial or post-colonial, but amidst a world that is incredibly colonial, incredibly oppressive. And continues to cause colonial violence and disaster around the world. So I mean, this is a very minor politics. It's a very, very small act. It's reading in my formulation, but I think it does kind of help us think about a certain type of politics that isn't waiting for the end of colonialism before it cheers. This is a way of taking care of one's egalitarian comrades in the meantime.
Thank you so much, Professor. And Pratim has a question as well. When some of the Indian thinkers were speaking of world literature, when Indian thinkers are talking about trading the literature of another country, cultivating mastery and expertise through reading text prescribed by colonial masters, I mean back in early 20th century. So my question is here, why the revolutionaries didn't follow the same? Why did they choose to disavow it? If you can shed some light on
it. So I think this is the kind of basis for how I started this project. So you've gotten to the kind of core of it, right? So the kind of initial way of thinking about this was precisely that it is mean, this is something like Gauri Vishwanathan's project or Priya Joshi's projects. It is precisely under the guise of literature that that Britain was the British Raj was able to maintain control. So, in other words, there's this direct relationship between an author who is white and British and often male and British authority, right? That line is so very clear. So this is Vishwanathan's Mask of Conquests. And then Priya Joshi in another country shows that this was not so straightforward, the kind of a dominant project, but it was much looser. And so it's precisely that a certain type of Anglophone literary education taken from forced upon the subjects of the British Raj, immediately connected the author to authority, then to British Raj authoritarianism, that to think anti-colonially, to think as an anti-colonial thinker would necessarily then be to think as an anti-authoritarian thinker, anti-author. And so one doesn't simply want to replicate the white British men authors precisely because those come along with white British men being authorities, but rather one wants to kind of think about a way of reading that moves aside from that, that thinks about reading and authorship and critique as in a different sort of way than as dominance. And so I think it's very much a question of something like Bhagat Singh wanted to engage with this Anglophone canon, but he wanted to engage with it differently, right? So, for example, he loved Uncle Tom's Cabin for reasons that are still somewhat inexplicable, but he engaged with it in a way that rendered it non-authoritative. In fact, he made it useful. He made Uncle Tom's Cabin a completely revolutionary text for a radical egalitarianism, precisely, in fact, by moving aside from the author and thinking otherwise about what authority and the author might look like.
Thank you, Professor. And so, like this theory of reading, of like not claiming authorship, and it's just like what's it's like the death of the author. So, in ancient Indian practices, especially I'm talking like very ancient Indian practices, and the oral tradition was in place. Maybe in later times also, when Sanskrit or other hegemonic languages were in the society. So many of our the authors, we don't know who the writer or the author is because they didn't used to put their name. They just continued in the oral tradition. Like, can you relate a bit of that to this theory of reading?
I mean, I think this was something that certainly Ambedkar was trying to think about. I mean, one of the questions of the long history of the Manusmriti is that it doesn't have an author necessarily, except its author is Manu, right, who is this kind of anonymous authority figure, right? And so, so although the laws of Manu doesn't have, it's not one person who authored it, but rather a kind of collective set of Brahminical practices or whatever it was when it was collected. Certainly by the 20th century, certainly by the 19th century, it had become an authoritative text on caste. And consequently, or relatedly, or concomitantly, Manu had become, without any kind of body of an actual human, an author and an authority. And so, so here's a text which presumably has no author, and yet its authorness is Manu, and Manu is the supreme authority and creator and police of caste. And so here's a text that doesn't have an author, but nevertheless figures out a way to propel authority. And then Ambedkar does this with many Puranas and a lot of the Vedas at the same moment that the Arya Samaj is trying to negotiate this as well. So it's a complicated. This is precisely what leads up to annihilation of caste being an undelivered lecture for the Arya Samaj. but I don't know if it's the death of the author. I think it's just simply a sort of, that seems so resolute and confrontational. I think this form of kind of critique is actually, I mean, this is something like what Walter Benjamin was described as being in total awe of the artwork, right? So not wanting to master it, not wanting to kill off the author, but actually, being a critic rather. So, one finds oneself, simply enjoying reading a book, simply loving looking at a piece of art. And that's a different relationship than the reader that Budd imagines, and it's certainly not the author that Budd kills off, but it's something in between, and it's a way of thinking about. Ideally, it's a way of thinking about literature differently. It's certainly a way of thinking about canon formation differently, but it's a certain type of standing in awe. And rather than needing to master a literary work.
Sorry, I can unmute myself. Yeah, thank you so much. Opened up so many new vistas and everything. And Dr. Pramnik is also here. Professor, if you'd like to say something to Dr. Elam.
No, I was just listening, Professor Elam, and the model is seriously fascinating model, and it really provokes us to think world literature in different way. Thank you, many thanks.
No, thank you very much. It's, I've read your work, and I really am also a fan, a critical fan of your work, and a reader, and so it's a pleasure to be part of the conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you for joining us today. It was an amazing session. And also the participants who are there is already in the website, we have put in your contact details, and they can maybe contact you and reach out to you if they feel like they have any more questions.
Yes,
And Pratim, do have, yeah.
No, thank you.
Have
any... I'm sorry.
Yes. No, it's okay. It's okay. Pratim, do you have any more questions?
No, Artika, I don't have anything to add today. I think we don't have any more questions also. So, if we can conclude the session now.
Yes, we can conclude the session. I just want to ask one thing that you're talking about how this egalitarian thoughts of a world without colonialism is occurring in the minds of this author, so they're writing about it. Is it only possible when the nation is going through a very violent phase or a very problematic phase? Can you not think of a utopian egalitarian world without facing violence, or maybe when you're in a stable condition?
I mean, this is, I guess I suppose I apologize for having two answers for every question, and each answer contradicts the other. But on one hand, I think the kind of the founding text of post-colonial studies, part of Chatterjee's work, the question has always been about the nation, and it sets up a question, which is a derivative discourse or whatever, and so which sets up this kind of problematic of you can't have anti-colonial thought unless you have colonialism, which is someone asked, someone was kind of provoking me to say, why are you interested in, you're upholding colonialism by looking at anti-colonialism? And I think if there was a world without colonialism, and which led to a world without anti-colonialism, I would take that world and figure out something else to do with my life. That would be the world that I would love to see. But there is colonialism, and therefore we need the anti-colonialism, the anti-colonial thought to counter it. The other way of answering the question, I guess, is a bit even more, I suppose, even bleaker, which is to say that one way of transitioning this conversation is from a question of colonialism, a question of colonialism to a question of the Anthropocene, right? How do we are going to be extinct, and so at some point, how do we? And there's not much we can do about that at this point. The question then becomes, how do we take care of each other, and how do we ensure a certain type of egalitarianism occurs in the face of that, right? I mean, just as like we talked about with COVID, COVID reminds us that contagion it thinks of the world as egalitarian, and yet we then insist on remaking racist and casteist policies. The Anthropocene sees the world as egalitarianism. Our job is to, much like our job should have been with COVID, is to refuse the fact that some people will suffer first and before other people will suffer from global climate change, but rather to see this as a project of we're all in the boat together, and to act on behalf of climate change refugees coming from Middle East, North Africa, people, the farmers' strike in Delhi, for example, is another moment of this, right? So in other words, to see global climate change as the chance to enact an egalitarianism that helps us take care of each other equally in the face of what will most likely be the end of us, to put it in its bleakest form.
Yes, thank you, Professor Elam. Thank you so much. And yes, climate change represents a very big concern now, as we can see also happening in the Sundarban area of Bay of Bengal and everything. Profi, if you may.
Yes, yes. Okay. So a big thank you on behalf of the team Calcutta Comparatives 1919 and its members for joining us today. And I'd like to convey our hearty thanks to Professor G. Daniel Elam for his excellent talk on the topic of impossible breeding. A new avenue, I think, will open up today, and perhaps we'll in near future we'll get to read more about it. A big thank you to Professor for sharing your ideas and views on this area, and our sincere gratitude to you from all of our team members. Uh, I would like to uh, conclude this session now, and good day and good night to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good night to all of you, and good evening to Professor Elam. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Live, live